Prequel, The Walls in the Middle of Idemia, Chapter 3, Part B. Banu was there, tapping her foot. You took him along to... Where did you go? Banu, I'll beg forgiveness later. For now, I need you and Ralph. We have some things to discuss, and yes, Banu, I'll tell you everything. 10 minutes later, she remained motionless on the sofa, mystified. 25 people at least? I'll bet there's more, Ralph said, his leg bouncing anxiously. He'd been bursting, but Pere wouldn't let him speak until he finished. Father, I have some questions. I know you do, and your mother can help answer them. That boy Fangy, his father and brother died, then his mother had another baby to replace the son she lost for clematis. I know we already had this talk, but doesn't a baby take 9 to 10 moons to be born? Yes, it does, Banu said, wringing her hands angrily. And that's a well-proven fact. But it sounds like Fangy was born 2 years after his father died. So, Quarrel is his father, Pere announced heavily, and Banu shivered as if spiders were going down her back. It's obvious. The fourth, or maybe even the third. They both have that bumpy, bulbous nose. Ralph was sneering. Fangy's father is... Oh, that's gross. Banu shuddered again. His mother had that baby to give Clematis a mate, she said bitterly. What if she'd had a girl? What then? Pere, she exclaimed. Fangy said he has an older sister. That means his mother had 3 children. I was going to ask about that, Ralph said. Aren't women allowed to have only 2? Yes, Pere said in leaden tones. Only 2. In fact, the kings were the ones who saw to it that any woman who had 2 children never had more, to keep the population in check. Until the rest of the land outside our civilized world is no longer poisoned, we can't run the risk of overpopulation. That was another reason why the Great War was fought, over land and children. He and Banu exchanged a meaningful look. They deliberately had only 1 child, because if Banu had a second baby, the king's doctors would take her away for a few days, and she'd return a shattered woman in extreme pain. The procedure would take her another 2 moons to recover from. But if she never risked a second child, she would never have to suffer for it. Apparently no one in the mansion suffered that way. While that was to be celebrated, it was also to be resented. Pere and Banu had longed for another child, for another 3 or 4 even, but it was impossible until the world changed. They were grateful for the strong son they had, and in quiet moments wondered what his siblings may have been like. Wait, well, Ralph remembered, not noticing the looks of longing his parents shared. The Great War? Those 2 in the mansion think the war's still going, don't they? Yes, they do, Pere said. Clematis confirmed that for me. And she believes there are no other boys in Idemia now, except for you. Mother, Ralph turned to her, she didn't know anything about math, except how to count to 100. And books? She didn't know what books are. How can they not know about books? Doesn't Quarrel have any upstairs? Pere pondered that. Now that I think about it, no. I've seen ledgers and loose papers, but not any books. How strange. How purposeful, Banu said with atypical anger. They're keeping their own family as stupid as possible. If you don't know there aren't any other boys, you won't go looking for them. If you don't know there are any other numbers, you won't try to count them. If you don't know there are any other options, you won't try to take them. Pere, what are you going to do about this? He puffed in pride to see his wife now on her feet, punching her fists in the air. Will you help me? He asked. With anything, she exclaimed. This can't continue. I'll help too, Father, Ralph said. Then he stood up because it seemed to be the thing to do. Our son is very generous, dearest, he said to Banu. Offer to give Clematis his math books. We need to give them to her. All of them, lots of books, Banu decided and marched over to a bookshelf. Here, these are easy to read. Ralph's old childhood tales. We can bring these over and... No, Pere cut in. No, we can't. What? Banu cried. No one knows what I know, he reminded her, except for possibly Eugene Humphrey. Banu held the book to her chest and turned to face her husband. What do you mean? I mean, he was waiting for us. Not really, Ralph said. We just ran into him. He said he was on his way to Pools, but he said he was stopping to clear his head first. Think, son, the mansion is nowhere near the road to Pools. He was tipped off. Someone told him where we went, and he was waiting. And he seemed very edgy. Well, edgier than normal. Who is he working for, and who told him? I don't know. Stumpy was very lax in his last years, and many little spy networks grew up around him. I have no doubt that someone in the mansion is in contact with someone at the garrison, but I don't know who. They saw us, though, and sent for Eugene, who's going to play innocent until the moment is right. Banu frowned. Right for what? To expose me, to turn me in, to become the next High General, he said coolly. But Eugene nominated you for the position. Yes, he did, expecting I'd take him as my advisor when I won. Then he could control things for me and even take over if things didn't go as he and others expected. He knew he couldn't get the soldier votes I'd have, but once I'm thrown out, he could easily step over to my office and make himself at home. If they can't manipulate me, and they're discovering quickly that I'm no Stumpy, then they're going to discredit me and try a new tactic. Call me paranoid, but since I don't know who's working for whom, if anyone is actually on my side beside the enlisted men who I bribe with snacks, I can't trust anyone. Oh, Ralph said, his voice small. That's why you didn't want me to speak until we got home. Exactly. There are spies everywhere, unfortunately, walking casually past, following a few steps behind, waiting in a shrub. It's also why I don't employ servants or want to move into a larger home where we would need servants. Trust no one, Ralph, even your servants. They'll bring you your meal with a smile one day, then stab you in the heart the next. Pere, Banu exclaimed, that's not fair. My friend is a servant. And maybe we'll employ her when all of this mess calms down. Until then, I stand by what I say, Ralph. If not the servant, then the relative or friend of one. Remember that anyone in power is a target for anyone without power. Ralph gulped. Yes, sir. You mean that, Pere? Banu asked. Every word. About Matilda? I'm sorry, who? My friend, trying to get on at the mansion. You'll hire her later? Sure, in time. Banu clapped her hands in glee. Other issues first, Banu, Pere reminded her. The mansion? That's right, she said, patting the book in her arms. Books for the mansion. No, Pere burst out. Not books, not any little help, but big help. Real help. What do you want to do, Father? Ralph asked, a little intimidated to see his father growing angry. The jolly general was fairly fuming. The only thing that should be done. We're going to free them. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Ralph said, How are you going to do that? Carefully, Pere said, very carefully. Queen Jessie took the folded note from the king's guard. He bowed deeply as he handed it to her, but she waited to unfold it until he left. He didn't know how to read. None of them did. But still Jessie couldn't risk it. Once he was well on his way down, she marched to her letters room, shut the door, glanced around to make sure all was quiet, then opened and read the note. She growled at the news, paced back and forth, screeched at a painting of a flower on the wall, then finally sat down to the wide writing desk. Jessie pulled out carefully cut parchment slices, only she had that quality of parchment with that tint of gold, and inked the message, "Next job, get the blob." She pondered that, tipped her head, then smiled. Crossing out the blob, she instead wrote, "The son of the blob." That would send a memorable message to never sneak around her house again. Her killing squad had been restless lately. This would satiate them. As if she'd disband her squad just because General Blob demanded it. Who did he think he was? She folded and sealed the parchment into one of her specialized envelopes. The guard would know where it was to go with the evening messages. Then she left her letters room and locked the door. No one was allowed in there, ever. She pulled onto the pipe near the wall and shouted nonsensically into the speaker. Her voice would echo throughout the corresponding pipes in the mansion, and within 2 minutes the flower name girl was panting at her door. "You called, Queen Jessie?" Jessie pointed to the message on the desk. "Bring it to the guard for delivery." Flower name curtsied and turned to leave. "Stop," Jessie said, and Flower name turned, looking worried. Jessie stared at her for a moment, unsure of how to say what she wanted without giving anything away. "How are you and Bucket Boy doing?" Flower name glanced nervously around. "He's just a little boy, ma'am. We won't be sharing a room for many, many years yet. He's very young." "I see," Jessie said, and fingered a plate which had held her afternoon snack of cream pie. "But you're satisfied with him?" The girl shrugged, not meeting Jessie's eyes. Blast it! She'd seen the younger blob. She knew that there were others out there. "Flower name!" Jessie barked, and the girl jumped. Jessie tried to speak kindly. "Give Bucket Boy time. He will likely grow to be very impressive. You won't regret waiting for him." Flower Girl nodded and tried to smile, but it was a pathetic attempt. "Yes, ma'am," she said obediently. "Is there anything else?" She was gripping the message tightly in her hand, and Jessie was relieved it was the parchment and not the flimsy paper they were now making near the forests. The girl would have sweated through and shredded that message before she got down the 3 flights of stairs. "No, go. Deliver that. Needs to go out this evening to my regular man." Flower name nodded, curtsied, and darted away. Less than a minute later, Clematis was now in the secret narrow passage behind the ugly dog painting with convenient eye-hole cutouts which allowed for spying on the throne room. Quirrell the Fourth was in there, arguing something with his advisors, which Clematis didn't find interesting. But what was in her hands was. She knew that only certain messages went out on that parchment, and that for the past 2 years only she had been trusted to get it to the correct cousin guard who delivered it to the messenger outside the walls. But what no one knew was that she had taught herself to read. She'd been sneaking out discarded papers, asking Fangy to retrieve them for her from the kindling boxes so she could try to decipher the shapes. She'd figured out all of the letters, asking a relative here and there what sounds letters made. Some of the older members of the family remembered a few. Then she'd sit in that passage where she could, spying on the Quirrells and listening to drafts of decrees written on paper until the perfect draft was penned on the parchment. Quirrell the Third had been a most vocal, always shouting, always repeating what was on the pages to point out to his more timid advisors how something was wrong or inane. Most of the paper decrees were then tossed in the kindling bin, and Clematis, who had an excellent memory, compared them to what she heard Quirrell the Third shouting over and over to his advisors. Quirrell the Fourth wasn't nearly as useful to learning to read, Clematis realized a few moons ago. All Quirrell the Fourth ever did was sit in a chair and mope, while Queen Jessie yelled at him. So it was a good thing she'd learned to read while Quirrell the Third was still alive and yelling. There was something else she had, secreted in a false panel under the dog painting. She had stolen it. The only thing she'd ever stolen in her life, ever. from Orrin's shelves when she was once tasked with tidying it up. Auntie Helga, who normally cleaned the king's rooms, had been ill for many days. So when Clematis was 12, she changed jobs for a week. That's where she found them, in the room where the boys slept, rows and rows of pages bound together with leather and string. Since Orrin and Quirrell V were out with their grandmother, Clematis pulled those strange things out and thumbed through them. They were shapes, all kinds of shapes, in tidy rows, with occasional dots and slashes and marks. Clematis was fascinated and knew it was something important, something kept from her. Intrigued, she pulled out another and another, making sure to put them back carefully again. Finally, she pulled out one where the shapes were much larger, and only a few on each page, and they were simple line drawings to go with them. Something in her chest seized as she looked at that, and realized it was much simpler than the others. The drawings were for children, she surmised, and then she understood. This one was to teach children how to figure out the shapes. That's when she stole it. Impulsively, guiltily, lovingly. She shoved it in her apron pocket and, feeling near to retching in fear, rushed it down to her bed and hid it under her pillow. Then under her bed. Then in her underthings drawer. Then behind the silk curtains. Then half a dozen other places until nerves finally led her to the secret passage where she knew no one else ever went. She'd scattered teaspoons of flour lightly on the floor after she'd leave each time, knowing if someone followed, they'd leave tracks. In the 4 years she'd been using that passage, no one had ever left tracks. She also accidentally found a loose panel in the wall there when she hurried into the secret passage one day, nearly being caught by Queen Jessie, who'd been in a huff to get somewhere else. Clematis had stumbled against the wall in her haste, and the false panel gave way, revealing a convenient place to hide anything thin. She opened the panel now, finding again the beloved bound pages, sure that she now knew the name of it, book. That was what Ralph was talking about. And there were books about numbers? Oh, too wonderful, she thought as she took out one book she now considered her own. She could read it, too. This is a cat. This is a mat. This is a rat. This is a dog. It made the rat go splat on the mat. The cat did not splat. It wasn't the most riveting story, and the drawings were a little harsh if they were for children, especially the drawing with the word splat. But the book was enough to get her started, and with the pages she had Fangy take, and the conversations she'd listened into, and the few things that the greats downstairs remembered, she taught herself to read. With trembling hands, she now eyed the message from Grandmother Jessie in her hands. Oh, no one ever called Jessie grandmother to her face, and Clematis often wondered why they gave such a term of endearment to such an awful woman. But as part of the family, albeit on the highest level, she was referred that way. Not entirely lovingly, though. Grandmother Jessie loved no one, that was certain. And whatever was in this message was to make sure the world had one less unloved person in it. She patted her pocket to make sure she had matches there. Yes, she could remelt the wide wax seal just enough to reseal the envelope. She patted her pocket to make sure she had matches there. Yes, she could remelt the wide wax seal just enough to reseal the envelope. Her hands shook so much she could barely peel off the seal without cracking it. The last time she did this, nearly 6 weeks ago, the message was about the ugly woman. Clematis knew who that was. Quirrell IV's wife, mother of Fifth and Orrin. In fact, that's all the message said, the ugly woman. Clematis thought this was horribly unfair. Margot was a pleasant woman who smiled at the family, spoke kindly the few times that she did speak, and seemed very, very sad. Maybe that's why Jessie called her ugly. A woman that sad rarely looks beautiful. Clematis wondered what she was always sad about, but never dared speak to her. No one was allowed to. Clematis had thought the message was sent out by Jessie so that someone could bring her sweets or silk from the city. But shortly after, when Margot was suddenly not there anymore, Clematis began to think something horrible had happened, and that the gold-tinted parchment had something to do with it. She had to know what this new message said. Maybe this was a clue for the High General, and maybe he'd come back with his son. At that thought, Clematis fumbled so much that she dropped the message, and then dropped it again because she couldn't get out of her mind the image of that boy. Another boy. Never mind, she told herself, and carefully unfolded the envelope, then pulled out the message. She stared at it, a ball of nausea growing in her belly. Next job, get, the blob crossed out, the son of Blob. It was easy to read, as easy as the book she owned. But if there was an illustration with it, Clematis knew she'd find it even more repulsive than the splat. She dropped the note on her lap and held her face with her hands. Jessie wanted something to happen to the son, to Ralph. No! Then there'd be only Fangy, but another boy? That's why Jessie had asked if she was satisfied with Fangy. How could she be when there was a boy like Ralph in the world? Clematis had to do something, had to stop whatever this was supposed to be. But how? Her face felt flushed and hot. It took her nearly 5 minutes. Yes, she knew how to count time. She'd learned that on her own as well. To finally reseal the letter, affix the wax seal, and make her way out of the passage unnoticed. She trotted to the cousin guard messenger who sat by the second back door and presented it to him with a little bow. He nodded once. He was her mother's cousin. Then he left for the side gates guarded by men in blue. Usually that's as far as Clematis ever watched, but today she slipped back inside the doorway to spy on him. How far did the cousin ever go? He was back already, Clematis noticed. He merely gave the message to the soldiers who shut the gate behind him. Whistling, the cousin sauntered down to the barns where he'd probably take a nap in the hayloft. Clematis clenched her trembling fingers into fists because an idea was growing in her mind. She estimated she had about 5 more minutes before she'd be looked for to help in the kitchens again, so she had to move quickly. She rushed back up to her secret dog painting passage, opened the hidden panel, retrieved a piece of paper filled with words and numbers, which she'd used to study strange sounds like sh and g and mps, and evaluated the backside. It would suffice. But what could she use to write with? It was too risky to steal anything from the throne room, even worse to take something from Orin and Quirrell V's learning room. Clematis came to a decision. She slipped out of her passage again, went down to the basement, and into the room of the grates. Danny was rolling yarn again. She suspected it was always the same ball, but since he was nearly blind, he'd never know it. And Seraphina was knitting. Next to her was a big crate of sewing supplies. "Clematis," Seraphina smiled as she entered the room. "How are you, child?" "Good," she said, hoping she sounded light and cheerful, although she was normally ornery and impatient. May I borrow a needle? I have a little sliver to dig out." "Oh, I can help you with that," Danny said mischievously, and he patted around himself for his pocket knife. "Just point me in the right direction." Clematis laughed, knowing it sounded tight and nervous, and said, "Thanks, I can do this myself. Just a small sliver. Thank you," she said to Seraphina as she retrieved the sharpest needle she could find. Maybe only 4 minutes now, until she was missed. Her heart was bouncing up to her throat, and she ducked into her room and shut the door. Taking a deep breath, then another and another, she finally stabbed her palm. It didn't bleed as much as she had hoped, so she tried another vein sticking out in her wrist. That stab stung, and it bled more than she expected. Exhaling in frustration and counting down the time in her head, she worked as quickly as she could. That's when she realized that while she'd memorized the shapes of letters, she'd never actually written them. Her note was sloppy and maybe gory, but the letters were legible. It had to do. She wrapped a kerchief around her wrist. Yes, the sliver was deeper than she expected. That would be her excuse. And she folded the note as best she could. She had no envelope, but this would have to be enough. Maybe 1 minute left? She came up with another excuse. Berries. She needed some, just had a craving for fresh ones, and headed back outside. The cousin messenger still wasn't there, and the way to the side gate was free. Filling her lungs with fresh bravery, she strode to the gate and wondered how one got the attention of the soldiers on the other side. So she knocked, simple enough, and it worked. One of the men, maybe in his mid-30s, was wide-eyed when he opened the gate to Tiny Gap. This never happened more than once a day. Clematis stood tall and slipped the message to him through the gap. Please, for the High General. That was as long as her bravery lasted, because at any moment the war could come barreling through and destroy her and the family. So she turned and ran her fastest back to the mansion, up the stairs and into the kitchen, where she peeled potatoes until her breath came back to her and her heartbeat returned to normal. It took more than an hour. The sergeants stared at each other, dumbfounded. Duvera, has that ever happened before? One asked the other. Never, Longton. What do we do? Sergeant Duvera shrugged. One of us brings it to the High General, obviously. In a low voice, Sergeant Longton said, Does anyone else besides us know he and his son were here? No, and it needs to stay that way. Then, realizing that maybe his answer wasn't as correct as they assumed, he stared at his companion. One of us needs to deliver this, Longton said, but that leaves the gate untended. When has anyone ever approached these gates? Duvera murmured. Well, we've been at this job for only a few weeks since we replaced those useless King's Guards, but counting today, I'm betting never. But today, suddenly things are different. Duvera smiled hesitantly. That's because the High General is different. I'll bring it, and I'll try to call a backup for you. What about the other message? Longton reminded. The one given to you by that guard 10 minutes ago? Duvera pondered that, then said, I think the High General has time to read 2 messages, don't you? Besides, the man who picks those up won't be around here until dinner. When has he ever come earlier? I don't know, but we haven't done this job very long. And that will be our excuse. Pere sat at his desk, glaring helplessly at the piles of files. He hated paperwork, and hated even more that old Stumpy hadn't bothered with any of it. That meant it was all now his. Years' worth of crates waiting in 2 huge offices. Too bad there couldn't be another fire like the one that destroyed all the world's family lines in ancient history some years ago. While that was a true tragedy, burning all of these past Army files would be an act of mercy. At least for Pere it would be. A knock at the door was most welcome. Enter, he called cheerfully. His secretary, a lean and clever lieutenant, winced in apology as he opened the door. Sir, I know you don't like to be disturbed. When have I ever told you that when I'm dealing with files? The lieutenant smiled, still not used to working for a man who actually had a personality. True, sir, but there's someone here to see you. A sergeant who says it's urgent? Yes, let him in. Pere nearly shoved the files aside, but that would have caused a cascade again that he didn't want his poor lieutenant to clean up once more. His visitor came in cautiously. It wasn't often that the enlisted man visited the highest authority in the garrison. When Pere recognized who it was, he leaped to his feet and came quickly around the desk to shut the door himself, and locked it. Sir, Sergeant Duvera began, I know this isn't protocol, but something's happened we thought you'd be interested in. He held up 2 folded pages, one in gold-tinted envelope, the other filled with strange black and red writing. Pere put his finger to his lips to signal to the sergeant to speak more quietly. He hadn't chosen his secretary, the garrison had, then took the messages. From? One from the mansion's messenger, to be delivered to a man who comes every evening wearing a straw hat, De Vera whispered. Then the other was brought to us about 10 minutes later from a teenage girl. Pere's eyebrows rose in surprise, and the sergeant nodded. She seemed terrified, sir, so I brought it right over. I know you didn't tell us to. Don't apologize. You did the right thing. I told you to take initiative, didn't I? This is exactly what I was hoping you would do. De Vera relaxed, and Pere weighed the two messages. Let's start with the official one, shall we? He opened it and smirked when he saw the blob, then frowned when he read son of. Dear Creator, he whispered. Although he was never much of a praying man, now seemed to be a good time to begin. May I, sir? The sergeant asked. Pere handed it over. Well, that's rude. Then De Vera paled. Wait, what does this mean? Pere swallowed. Not entirely sure yet, but working on a theory. He remembered the other message in his hands and opened it. One side was filled with black ink script, practiced and clear, about a new taxation formula. The Quirrells were always looking for ways to increase gold and silver coming into the mansion. But why send this? Pere turned it over to see the red side. Is this written in blood? De Vera recoiled as he looked over the High General's shoulder. The girl did have a kerchief wrapped around her wrist. Hot gravy, Pere exclaimed. The girl used her own blood? What is she trying to say? He set the page on the desk because the words were so clumsy he was going to need help deciphering it. Looks like a 5-year-old wrote it, the sergeant said in a disapproving tone. Or perhaps it's the first time someone has ever tried to write a letter using her own blood, Pere snapped. True, sir. Very sorry, sir. Together they made out the print. Pere, Jesse is bad. Wants to hurt your boy. Take care. Save him. Calamadis. De Vera let out a low whistle. Sir, may I venture a guess? Go ahead, Pere whispered. Queen Jessie still has her killing squad. Got it in one, Sarge. Sir, we need guards at your house. Your son is on his way home from school right now. And this message did not get to Jessie's friends, did it now? Pere said, folding it up again and trying to keep his voice steady. And rather successfully, he thought, considering he just realized he'd set up his son to be the next target. There is no danger yet. What do you do with these messages from the mansion anyway? Give them to that messenger of Jessie's? When does he arrive? Usually around dinner time. Pere tapped his finger on the message. Dinner time's in about an hour, right? He looked at the careful script of the first message. Very predictable script at that. You're going back, and you're going to deliver this message to that man. But first, we're going to modify it a bit. We need a woman's hand, though. His tapping increased. I know, he snapped his fingers. That surgeon assistant, the blonde woman, she wrote me out a list of what foods I'm not supposed to eat anymore. She had very neat script, just like this. Go get her. De Vera was already grinning. Yes, sir, can I see her handwriting? I threw away the list, but I remember her hand. Hurry! As the sergeant rushed out the door, Pere studied the message. There already was one line crossed out, so further modifications wouldn't be suspicious. A few minutes later, the surgeon's assistant came into the room, very confused, but with an expression of optimism, to realize that she was in the High General's office. She was slender and energetic and old enough to be his mother, and acted like it with annoying frequency. She meant well, but she didn't understand that food was sacred. She treated it like an experiment, to be measured and analyzed and presented in tiny portions. She was no fun at all. Sir, she exclaimed with too much hope, the sergeant here said you were ready to try some of our recommendations. De Vera shrugged and Pere smirked. Whatever tactic works, that's what the enlisted men were taught. No, Pere said kindly, but I have a more important task for you. First, I need to know, what's your security clearance? The highest a civilian can have, she said proudly. That was under General Stumpy. What is it under me? She blinked, insulted. Sir, I will maintain complete confidence in anything. I'm one of the few women to be employed by the garrison, and I take that as an incredible honor. I would never do anything to betray you or the army, sir. My father was an officer, you know, and I knew your father as well. Colonel Reculfus Shin was an excellent man, sir. Pere held her gaze in his throughout her little speech, watching for any giveaway, any tell. There was none. He nodded once and whispered, "Thank you. Well, I have no choice but to trust you. I need you not for your diet suggestions." Her expression fell. For a woman in her 60s, she was in excellent condition and could probably wrestle a hog into submission. She rather seemed to have hoped that would have been why she was called, if not to advise the general on how to lose weight. "But I need you for something infinitely more important." "More important than the health of the High General?" Pere put a finger to his lips before whispering, "The most important thing of all, the life of my son." She took a hard step backward. "Oh, sir, is he ill? Injured? I am fully trained, but let me get the top surgeon." "No, he's not injured yet, and you're going to help me make sure it stays that way. You have lovely penmanship, by the way. Would you please copy the following words for me?" The sergeant panted as he returned to his position next to his companion. "Where have you been?" Sergeant Longton murmured. "I've been alone for over an hour now." "What's wrong? Did someone actually come by?" Duvera looked around interestedly. "No, I just got bored," Longton admitted. "Well, I've got news, and you'll be glad you waited. But first, we have a message to deliver to that man who comes around. Silence until then." They stood at attention, occasionally pacing in front of the gates to keep their blood pumping, their senses alert. Eventually the man came, dressed in nondescript trousers, a faded old green jacket over a tidy white shirt. On his head he wore a wide-brimmed straw hat, pulled down nearly over his eyes, making it difficult to discern the color of his hair. His scruffy beard, however, was a dark brown. When the sergeants took over gate duty several weeks ago, at the insistence of High General Shin, and despite the temper tantrum of Queen Jessie, Duvera and Longton were told by Jessie herself that she would still insist her regular messenger would be treated with the utmost respect. He'd always wear the wide-brimmed hat, would always retrieve her messages, and no, the sergeants didn't need to know what kinds of treats and luxuries she's demanded from the city center each day. This was her little indulgence, her reward for her diligence to the city of Idumea and the world itself. She could still send her messages, and the High General would let them go, unless his sergeants felt something was wrong, a sentiment he shared only with them. His sergeants respected him. They'd been with him for over 10 years, beginning as privates joining his fort over in Marsh when he was a lieutenant colonel and at only 30 years old. But they soon seen why he was promoted so young in an army where most officers were so old. Shin was a man to be trusted, a man who would never let them down, a man who could subtly hand them bacon sandwiches when he passed them on guard duty. An officer who gives you free bacon sandwiches is a man you'll follow for the rest of your life. When he was promoted to colonel 3 years ago and transferred to Idumea to oversee supplies for the entire army, he asked his sergeants if they wanted to come along. "Because," he said, giving them each a thick slice of sweetbread his wife had made, "I don't trust city folk. No one ever should. I need 2 men I can always rely on. Also always follow a man whose wife makes such sweet bread." Duvera and Longton had been disappointed to learn a few weeks ago that they'd been assigned away from the garrison, and the general delivered snacks, until Shin walked them through the orchard, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "Men," he said as they sauntered near to the high stone wall of the mansion, "I need your eyes and ears. There are too many factions, too many spy networks, too many attached to the mansion and the army who don't care for the world but only for themselves. I need to expose them all, or this world will crumble." He said it so simply, so plainly, but his sergeants had felt their knees buckle. "There are very few people I can trust, but I believe in you two. So I'm giving you the most important position in the entire army. No other man in the 12,000 that I command in the world will have as much responsibility as you two." Then he pointed at the lonely gate, where two of Quirrell's guards in green watched them with loathing. "Seriously, sir?" Longtin whispered. "That?" "That," Shin murmured back. "I just have a feeling that the gate will be the key to changing everything. The problem is, I'm not yet sure what that everything is just yet, but I will. Can I count on you too?" Of course they'd said yes, and for the past 3 weeks had been passing the dullest duty in all of the world's army, standing in front of that lonely gate where the only travelers to go through had been the High General and his son, and where this man, they still couldn't tell his age or even his skin color, came every day and picked up Queen Jezzy's messages. Sometimes the parchment was thin and cheap, sometimes it was thick and expensive. Today, de Vera knew, was the highest quality of parchment in his fist, which he handed off to the man. The recipient never looked up, never acknowledged the sergeants. He just walked off through the old orchard and out to the main road again. De Vera and Longtin exhaled and exchanged places again in front of the gate. The most important thing had just happened, and no one knew it yet. It seemed that the most important events usually passed unnoticed, until it was too late to do anything about them. When Pere returned home from the garrison that evening, he did something he'd never done before. He told his guard that, yes, for once he did want them to stay and surround his house. The 6 men were surprised but delighted to finally do their job and took up positions around the modest structure only a quarter-mile away from the garrison. Pere walked into the house, his step heavier than normal. His son was at the table doing his homework, his wife on the sofa darning yet another sock. Pere didn't have the heart to tell her that she always fixed them in the lumpiest of ways. Banu looked up and smiled. "Your supper's on the table under the cloth. I'm sure you ate at the garrison, but I know how you miss my cooking when you work late." Pere wasn't smiling, nor did he rush eagerly to the table and playfully throw elbows at his son to make sure he didn't touch any of his late dinner. Instead, he said, "Banu, I've made a terrible mistake." To his astonishment, his wife and son looked at each other, then laughed. "What did I guess, Ralph?" Banu said. "Within a moon's time, right? He'd confess that." Ralph grinned. "She did say that, Father. So what'd you do? Offend a major somewhere? Tell General Humphrey to take smiling lessons? Or—" "No," Pere cut him off sharply, and his son and his wife stopped chuckling. "Banu, please forgive me, but it seems I've drawn the attention of something I don't know yet how to control." She frowned and put down the hopeless sock. "What do you mean?" There was no sense in prolonging it. "Jezzy sent to killing squad for our son." Banu nearly fell off the sofa. Ralph did fall off his chair. Pere merely looked down at him in sympathy. Wait, Ralph said, trembling. What are you talking about? How do you know? Why did she do this?" His voice pitched higher with each question. "I'm sorry, son. Someone knows you're in the mansion with me. That's the best I can figure. My sergeants intercepted a message from Jezzy that you are the next target. Probably trying to teach me a lesson or frighten me." "Intercepted the message?" Banu stammered. "Longtin and de Vera?" Pere nodded. "Oh, I always liked them," she said, forgetting for the moment why she liked them tonight. It caught up to her a second later. "But, Pere, if they stopped the message, then—" Ralph looked up hopefully from his spot on the oaked plank floor, but Pere was already sighing. "Jezzy never uses only one method of communication. She'd be foolish to do so. Her bookkeeper, who I interrogated the other day, accidentally confirmed that Jesse has different messengers for different times of the day. I'm only sure of the one at dinner time. There are others. Ralph's eyes were darting toward the thick, wavy glass in the windows. We're secure right now, Pere told him. I've got 6 guards tonight. A dozen more will be patrolling the road. Killing squads have never had more than 12 men. They'll be outnumbered. He patted his hip where his long knife was secured, then suddenly folded his arms to make sure the second was in his sleeve, and could feel the third still in his right boot and the fourth in his left. Ralph had his hand on his hip where his long knife was, and curiously Banny was patting her side as well. I'm very, very sorry, son, Pere said to Ralph as he held out a hand to pull him up. And Banu, please forgive me. I never should have brought him along to the mansion. Banu nodded and blinked rapidly. Tears were building in her eyes, and she dropped her stitching to hide her face in her hands. Pere sagged. He was never a bigger failure than when he made his wife cry. Oh, Banu, Banu, he said, stepping to her side and kneeling in front of her. Dearest, they're not going to get him. We're going to put an end to all of this, very soon. We're secure tonight, and I've put into action a plan to fix everything. She looked up, her face splotchy. How? She demanded, and Pere flinched at her anger. How will you fix this? I'm working on a plan, he stumbled in his words, still trying to figure out. No, she cried out. That's how you always do things, half thought out. You get a notion and just run with it, and the next thing you know, your son's life is in danger. You're not prepared for this sort of thing. Jesse's squads are very effective, and you know that. And very illegal, he exclaimed. I outlawed them just the other day with full army support. So what? Has she disbanded them? No one knows, and why should she? She thinks she's in charge, doesn't she? You can't keep going on like this, Pere. You're not just filling barns with uniforms anymore. You have to have real plans, real backup. You have to trust the army, and you have to think things through, not just make up plans on the run because you're no good at running. He swallowed down a variety of angry responses, and the random question as to why she thought he filled barns with uniforms, because she was correct on too many points. He couldn't get by on his charm and his luck any longer, and he began to suspect Humphrey was likely waiting for him to fail in just such a way. Eugene Humphrey always had a plan, always had contingencies, always had such dullness. Then again, knowing his son's life was in danger made dull seem very appealing right now. Ralph had come over to his mother's side. It's not Father's fault, he said quietly. I begged him to go along. I wanted to be part of whatever he was doing. It's my fault. No, it's not, Pere cut him off. It's Jesse's. Only Jesse's. We're trying to reverse all of that. We just didn't realize how clever and cruel she really is. So how did you find out? Banu asked him, her arms folded angrily. He had wanted to hug her and comfort her, but she was sending every signal to stay far, far away. The files, Pere admitted, the ones I've been avoiding. After I sent Duvera back, I was about to give up on the files when, well, I just had a feeling. I picked up a file, then another, and found one containing a report from some captains last year. They'd been conducting surveillance on the mansion themselves, curious as to what was going on there. They noticed that there were 3 times men picked up messages from the mansion. One at dinner time by the gate where I keep my men, one in the morning from the main front gate, and, he sighed, another one, who comes at random times to the back gate where deliveries are brought. He'd come and go with nothing in his hands from what they could discern. He'd just show up at the same time as the wood wagons, usually at night. The captains wrote up their findings and recommended someone should investigate, but after they presented their concerns, they were both transferred away. He massaged his hands anxiously. More messages may have already gone out, and a killing squad may have already been converging as of midday meal. His son had walked home from school completely vulnerable. The note his sergeants intercepted may have been a follow-up one or even a decoy. To the silence of the room, he said, "I've already sent for those captains. One stationed down in Orchard, the other over in Grasses. They should both be here by the morning. I've ordered them to travel at night. I think they'll suspect why I want them, and they'll be eager to arrive." Banu's chin was trembling. "And who ordered them transferred? General Stumpy?" "No," Pere whispered. "Eugene Humphrey's office." They knew. He and Lieutenant Colonel Lazen. And they directed attention away from the mansion. "I suspected Eugene wants me out of the way, but what if he's connected to the mansion somehow? Banu, I'll be honest. I'm beginning to think I'm sinking. I knew this position would be overwhelming, but..." Pere felt fear, real fear, that he couldn't find a solution. Could Humphrey actually be involved with the killing squads? It's not that they'd ever been good friends in the 3 years Pere had been serving at the garrison, but they had an amicable relationship, and working together as the Army's 2 generals had gone as well as could be expected in the few short weeks they'd been serving. But if Humphrey was involved with the killing squads, which he agreed with Pere needed to be disbanded. No. Humphrey had seen Pere and Ralph coming from the direction of the mansion. Did he have spies watching them actually enter and exit by the side gate? Even though he was in pools, did Humphrey have contacts willing to take out the boy whose name he could never get right? Pere felt he was sinking deeper into despair. He couldn't trust enough people in the garrison, knew only enough he could get on his side. Only 2 sergeants, maybe now 2 captains, and then... His wife must have picked up on his distress, because she pushed herself off the sofa and fell into his arms. He squeezed his eyes tight and let his wife hug him as hard as she could. "But you can do this, Pere. You must. You've got to get to the bottom of all these spies and make this place truly free. I know you can." "But," he whispered, "just a few minutes ago you were saying..." "Oh, I was just mad at you," she blubbered. "You know that." "Thank you," he mumbled into her hair. "I'll read more files. I might even make some myself. I'll stick to my desk more rather than running off like a new lieutenant." "But not right now," Ralph's voice cut in, and Pere opened his eyes to see his son standing over him, his eyes red and puffy. You can't read files right now. We have to fix the problems at the mansion first, and the killing squad thing." His voice cracked. Pere smiled and stood up, peeling his wife off of him so he could embrace his only son. "Absolutely. You and your mother will pack a bag and be prepared to leave before dawn." He held his son at arm's length to look him in the eyes. Ralph was nearly as tall as him now, just a few more inches to go. "I've arranged for you to leave by milk wagon before dawn. That won't be suspicious, and the milkman will be all the soldiers in disguise. We'll get you up to Vines via some back roads. I've got trustworthy connections in that fort. Jesse's men will never know where to find you. Once I put down the squad, and we will capture them, I'll send word for you to return." Ralph looked disappointed. "It feels like running away." "So what?" Pere nearly shouted. "Run!" Banu nodded. "It's the most sensible thing to do, Ralph. I'll find a bag for your clothes. We'll figure out something to tell your teacher and... Oh, Pere, something fell out of your jacket there." "No, don't!" he called, but Ralph was already picking up the paper with the black and dark red writing. "What is this? This side is normal," he said, unfolding it and taking it to the table where Pere looked up at the pine plank ceiling, knowing it was already too late. But this other side, whoa, is this written in blood? "Blood!" Banu exclaimed, coming to his side to look at the message on the table. Pere rubbed his eyes with his fingers as his wife and son murmured to each other to make out the message. A few seconds later, Ralph said out loud, "Calamitous?" "No," Pere sighed. "She doesn't know how to spell her own name. This may have been the very first thing she's ever written. She rushed it out to De Vera and Long Tin herself." "Clematis!" Ralph cried out. Father, she knows. Oh, the dear girl, Banu crooned. Look how sweet. Look how she tried to write, boy. Oh, isn't that precious? But Ralph was already thinking like a commander, for which Pere was both pleased and devastated. Father, I can't go anywhere. Clematis could be in danger, especially if Jessie or Humphrey have spies, especially if someone saw her deliver that note to your sergeants. Father, we have to get Clematis out first. Banu looked up from the message. Oh, dear, really? Is this what it means? Pere took a deep breath, knowing his milk cart escapes was about to be modified. Ralph, it would be safer to get you out first. But, Father, he said stoically, it'd be better to get Clematis out first. Banu frowned. I think you're both wrong. Why not just get everyone out of the mansion? I keep thinking of those old people in the basement with no indoor washing room. They deserve that luxury in their last years, don't you think? Clear out all those poor people, which will shake up Jessie and probably many of her plans, and then my friend Matilda can get a job there and be your own spy, Pere. Ralph and Pere stared at each other. Get them all out? Pere whispered, and his son's smile quirked up on one side. It just might work. But I'll need a bigger milk cart. The door to the secret passageway behind the ugly dog painting creaked open. It was a tight fit. It was easier to squeeze in when she was a new bride, spying on her father-in-law and his advisors, but Jessie could still fit in most of her body. With her reaching stick, she popped off the cover to the hidden panel and poked around the sheets of stolen pages from the kindling box. Yes, one was missing since yesterday. The slagging girl had sent a message. Stupid flower child. Now there'd be short one servant in a few years. Fangy's older sister had better start producing babies, or something more drastic would have to be done. But no matter. Her son Quirrell had no longer a jealous wife to worry about, and there were several women still of childbearing years. But how to dispose of the troublesome girl without anyone suspecting? Outside of the mansion, that was never a problem. She had the killing squads throw out many of their successes over the stone wall into the farm, and the family buried the war victims among the berries. There were still lengths of land with no bodies in it yet. But she'd never thrown a body out the other way before. Margot had walked easily away with her accompaniment, and someone in the family might actually miss this sour-faced girl. Ah, well, they'd get over it soon enough. Hardly anyone remembered the ugly woman anymore, and it had been less than 2 moons. Jessie stooped over as far as she could to pop the cover back over the panel. Then she blew gently on the flower that the flower-named girl always spread on the floor to detect disturbance. It was too easy to cover tracks, and that's why the girl deserved to die. She thought she was so clever, learning to read and count to whatever she could count to now, but she wasn't as clever as Jessie. That'd be the last thing she'd learn. Thank you. That is the end of Chapter 3, Part B.